You're listening to Radio Aula Mundi.
Hi there, wherever you are. I'm Marco Rixiker, a freelance writer, reporter, producer, teacher, translator, tour guide, poet, singer and songwriter. I speak several languages, and I'm the creator and founder of Radio Aula Mundi, an evolving podcast station where no language and all languages are spoken. It's a multilingual mix of music, poetry, lectures, languages, interviews, documentaries, recipes, and a lot more, co-produced with the students of the Aula Mundi International Cultural Center. You can find us on radioalamundi.bandcamp.com, podcasts.apple.com, Spotify, YouTube, Breaker, Player FM, Facebook. Search Radio Aula Mundi. The following narrative includes excerpts from a collection of testimonies and interviews entitled Let's Talk About It Anywhere in the World, where it is all about people's voices, accents, and speech patterns, hand in hand with my own personal anecdotes and observations. In addition to that, people are free to introduce themselves and speak their minds openly in their respective, often indigenous languages and dialects without any paraphrases or expectations. So, let the story go on from there. Chicago is not necessarily the kind of place that you would associate with indigenous cultures, but it is actually one of the cities in the US with the highest number of indigenous people living in an urban area. That information puts an indigenous woman by the name of Dorene Wiese on my radar screen when I read about her and her work in one of the Native American magazines I follow or subscribe to. I learn that she is involved in all kinds of community projects and grew up in South Minneapolis. And when I was in Chicago doing all kinds of interviews with people from all walks of life for a project entitled Wild Onion Soup, Sampling and Savoring in Chicago, Illinois, I did not have the opportunity to speak to an indigenous person. And an interview with Dorene Wiese would give me an opportunity to catch up both on my conversations with Chicagoans and on my knowledge about indigenous culture in the city. Something else I was not aware of was the existence of the American Indian Association of Illinois, AIAI. One of the things they do is to run indigenous community gardens in Chicago. Dorene Wiese is the president of the AIAI. She is Ojibwe, and one of the first things she is going to explain to me is the correct usage of names like Ojibwe, Chippewa, or Anishinaabe. Since her childhood has Dorene Wiese been a so-called urban Indian. It means that she is not entitled to subsidies generally given to Native Americans living on a reservation. In other words, so-called urban Indians or city Indians have not yet been recognized or qualified for federal aid and pretty much been left out of the system. And as far as setting the record straight is concerned, Dorene Wiese and I are also going to discuss the issue of how to call Native Americans. She is going to tell me that she prefers to use the legal term, which is American Indians. And to Dorene Wiese, they are the first inhabitants and the last survivors, especially those who grew up in an urban environment. But there is also the first generation of Indian revival, the first generation of the indigenous renaissance, the first generation of Indian resistance, etc. And it all started in the late 1960s when AIM, the American Indian Movement, was created. They launched unprecedented actions, such as the occupation of Alcatraz, which Dorene Wiese is going to mention as an example. And I can clearly detect pride in her voice when she declares that she belongs to that very generation. But she's also one of the last survivors in the sense that the languages and corresponding cultural traditions are disappearing and diminishing fast. One direct consequence is that in a city like Chicago, that has its own specific problems, including delinquency, crime, drugs, gangs, and so on, the native population suffers more than other ethnic minorities. Urban issues in Chicago also include increasing gun violence and a high murder rate. And again, they affect the indigenous population a lot more than other population groups. And that's the reason why I'm going to try to gear my conversation with Dorene Wiese towards revitalization efforts of cultural traditions and indigenous languages. Urban indigenous kids are also exposed to another phenomenon that they might not experience so much on the res, on an Indian reservation: prejudice, stereotypes, and racism, which Dorene Wiese herself had to endure while she was growing up in South Minneapolis. But that part of her biographical background has actually motivated her to share what she had to go through with others. It is a form of healing, she's going to insist. And healing through sharing is definitely one of the oldest indigenous cultural traditions. Dorene Wiese will also make it clear that healing is about learning from history in order to be able to build a future. History also includes the local history of Chicago, which she and I are going to discuss for a while. The indigenous name for Chicago speaks volumes about the kind of landscape the first European explorers must have seen in what is a big city today. The name means fields of stinky onions, referring to the white onions and white garlic that grew naturally on the shores of Lake Michigan and provided an additional food supply for the local Native Americans. So, indigenous food, as part of the general healing process, and the recovery of ancient cultural traditions is another topic Dorene Wiese and I are going to explore later during our interview. Finally, we are going to end our conversation with a poetry reading performance. It will be a powerful rendition of a poem written by an indigenous author who comes from almost the same town Dorene Wiese grew up in, Minneapolis. As a matter of fact, it's a special treat for her because she knows the author personally. It's Heid E. Edrick. So, the painful history of American Indians, even in today's day and age, have motivated Dorene Wiese to launch the American Indian Association of Illinois in Chicago.
My name is Dr. Dorene Wiese, and I'm president of the American Indian Association of Illinois, which is a nonprofit organization in Chicago, and also president of Native American Educational Services, which is also a nonprofit in Chicago, which was the only urban bachelor degree granting college in the country. And I'm so happy to be here with you today. Some of the activities that we are involved in focus on helping and working with our people in Chicago, which is an urban area. And Chicago, most Native people today live in urban areas, in cities. And over 70% according to the last two censuses. And there's a reason for that. Our people were pushed off their land land was stolen. There were all kinds of reasons, and people they couldn't survive on reservation land. So once they were able to leave, that's also the history of reservations in our country, that there was a time when people could not leave. They were like concentration camps, and you could be killed and imprisoned if you left. Then there were times, it's so important to understand where we are today, to understand that history. There were times, most of our people were killed. Over 99% of all Native people in North America were killed or died of disease. So we're really the last survivors of a great Holocaust of this country. And so we have some documentation and things that were created by the colonists. We have our oral histories, and we have our traditions and religions that were kept alive through those very small number of people that existed at the turn of the century. By 1890, they're saying that there were probably less than 200,000 people in all of North America. So it gives you an idea where we've come in a very short period of time, but that the injustices that we have that occurred continue today. So that's why our organization is focused on helping getting healthcare, education, employment, housing, youth services, and at the same for our people, at the same time trying to maintain their culture, their languages, their music and dance. We have the only American Indian dance company, and it is now over 35 years old. And we have young people and elders together learning about American Indian music and dance. We also have services for senior citizens, because our elders they're the people that survived, that were able to make a new life in these urban communities, but also they've suffered a lot because many of them were in boarding schools. And you'll be hearing and reading more about boarding schools where the government decided that Indian people were not capable of raising their own children, which we had done for thousands of years. But somehow the colonists decided we shouldn't be allowed to do that. And so that many of them lost their traditions and their languages and their cultures. So that we're dealing with that in our grandparents' generation, and that has trickled down into still modern day trauma. So we have programs that are geared looking at that. Then we have programs with young people who are fallen victim to gangs and drugs, just like every other community in the world. And so we're trying to keep them alive. And also Chicago is a very violent city where there's a lot of killings of young people. And so we also talk to our young people about that, about the dangers of gangs and guns and buying drugs off the streets like fentanyl. We've had so many deaths. We've had more deaths from fentanyl in Chicago among our Native young people than people that died of COVID. It's been more destructive for our community. I've worked in health for a long time. I was on a chair of Indian Health Board for over 12 years. And that's so important because our people have a lot of diseases brought on by the changes in foods over time that were non-traditional foods, and also the lack of health care consistently since the people were placed on reservations. So I would often talk about it as if we had all the medicines that we needed, but when we were moved and those areas were destroyed, let's say they were destroyed, the forests were destroyed for logging and things like that, we lost all of our, what I call it, our Walgreens. And I say to people, can you imagine if all the Walgreens were to go away, what would happen to Americans? And that's what happened to us. And so people they're afraid of Western medicine still. They're afraid of the cost, or afraid of people will, harm them. Because in the past, our parents thought of a hospital as somewhere that you went to die. So you can see that then people, though, the new generation, several generations younger than myself, they don't quite have that same view, but they still don't understand modern medicine, and they still have those fears brought from their parents. And then they don't, in this era, let's say of COVID, people didn't really know where, kind of what was going on and what they should do for themselves and their families. So I was involved in healthcare in our local clinic all through COVID. Trying to think of other things that we do. We do education. We have an after school program for young people, because there's no place where young people can learn American Indian history in our state. So that we try to teach them as much as we can in the little time we have with them. And we're also working on legislation now in the state to make a requirement that people learn about American Indian history. Because right now in Illinois, you have to learn about African American history. You have to learn about Latino history. You have to learn about Asian history. You have to learn about the Jewish Holocaust. But there's nowhere where the students have to learn about the people who were here originally. We are completely invisible from the media. I mean, I've been really fortunate that I've had all this media coverage in the last few years, but I really work hard at it. I started as a filmmaker. I wanted to be a filmmaker in the 1970s, but there were no jobs at that time for women filmmakers. So, it was always my love to work in media, to promote Native people, to build a more positive image for our people. So that's what I've tried to do. And today I have a children's program where I'm teaching Native youth of how to make their own films. So those are some of the things that we're involved in.
Dorene Wiese is located in Chicago at the time of our conversation, and she shares some fascinating information with me about the history of the name, its origins, indigenous alliances, and cultural connections way back when, long before the arrival of Euro-Americans in the Great Lakes area. They are the ones who misinterpreted the names of places, people, tribes, and cultures. And Ojibwe is the language Dorene Wiese's ancestors spoke, including in the area that is known today as Chicago. Please tell us the story of Chicago.
Well, there's actually no consensus on where the name came from. There are different varied meanings, from the stinky onion to the stinky skunk, but there's no agreement, because first, the largest group of the tribal people in the area were the Ojibwe people, and I'm from White Earth. I'm a White Earth Ojibwe. And then we had a couple groups that broke off from us, the Ottawa and the Potawatomi. They were very small. And so they left writing behind. The importance of writing now we can see in history. But so that the treaties that all had to do with Chicago were all with was called the United Nations of the Chippewa, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa. And we were the Chippewa. And the Chippewa are mentioned first because we're the largest. We were 20, 30, 40, 50 times bigger than the Potawatomis and Ottawas. So that is, so some of those words they come from our language, but we also have 130 different bands of Chippewas between the United States and Canada. So we all have some variation in the language, and there's not one text that is considered that everyone would use it. So we have a lot of people still that speak the language, but it's different variations of the same language. So that's still a mystery, and I'm sorry to leave you with that mystery. But I've looked into that myself, because people always ask, like, where did the name come from? And then people made up other names. We have some young people that made up some names, and I'm just gonna, kind of leave it as a mystery. But I think that it probably could be called by several names, but by the people that first observed it and named it. So that doesn't bother me that it has many different names.
Chicago continues to be a main topic at the beginning of my conversation with Dorene Wiese, between the imagination of what it must have looked like back in the day, long before the arrival of the first settlers, and what it's like now, with its remarkable diversity of indigenous people and nations. So right now, let's say what is now the Loop in downtown Chicago, what would you see?
You would see the lake come up much closer to probably to Clark Street, or even perhaps east of there. So you would see many people coming to Chicago to trade. Chicago has always been an area because you have the Great Lakes, and you have the Mississippi River's not that far, and the Chicago North Branch, and so you have the canal, and so you have a lot of and the main mode of travel was by canoe. So you have people from all over this Midwest area coming together. And of course, you have the Chippewa language was the language of communication. So even the colonists used it, but like you said, they couldn't really pronounce some of the words. And it's a difficult language to use because it's as if our people just kept adding on word parts in terms of describing things. Like it's often said, I can't say it, the word for blueberry pie is one of the largest words in the Ojibwe language. And it really is, if you look at it, it's probably like equivalent to about 2 solid sentences on notebook paper long, because it describes the crust and the berries and how they're cooked and, and their flavor. And so it's the language is very difficult. And I know I myself, I've tried to learn it and I only know words. And we do have language classes, but Chicago now has people from all over 150 different tribes live here. So I'm going to do a language class in 2 weeks on the Dakota language, because we have a large Dakota, Nakota, Lakota population. And we have had Navajo. We have a segment of Navajo people that live here all the way from New Mexico. And we have Choctaw people from Mississippi. And so there's a lot of variation in our own community in terms of tribes, languages, cultures, and all of that. So that makes it richer, but also a little bit more complicated.
Another part of my conversation with Dorene Wiese focuses on what is often called the indigenous renaissance. I try to cover as much ground as possible associated with this topic, from the use of indigenous languages to the way Native people would greet and welcome visitors way back when. To which degree could a conversation like ours contribute to that effort?
It's really important. Again, that's why I do anything in media I'm willing to do, because we need the conversations, even among our own people, because most people don't know the history. They haven't looked at the treaties. Most of our own people in our community, they don't know really what happened, how where their families lived. They might know where they might have lived in the last couple of generations, but really not too much about their tribal histories. And then about the people that struggled here, who were our own explorers to the urban areas, and who were the first people to live in apartments, to use elevators. I mean, I often think of it, it's similar to the immigrants and refugees that are here now from many different countries. And I was a dean. I come from the community colleges. I'm retired from the Chicago City Colleges. And I was a dean over many programs, the Bosnians and the Vietnamese and the Russians. And we had immigrants and refugees from all over the world. And I think we probably taught English to over 2 million people. So you can imagine that, again, Chicago's still that epicenter where people can go to school and they can work and they can make a new beginning. So I think, and for Native people, it was the same thing. They had to figure it out, and they had the same barriers, the language barriers of the immigrants and refugees. They had the longings for home. They might have started training, but then they didn't have any jobs when they wanted to go back home. So they ended up staying here. The experiences are very similar, but of course, this is our own country. We didn't come from somewhere else, just a few hundred miles away. But these conversations, they're so important because as you ask me questions, this is what I learned as a journalist and as a filmmaker. I have to think about these things in different ways. Now, after we leave, I'm going to have a whole bunch of new ideas of ways that I need to approach what we're doing. Our approach has most recently, I think, as a community, been on organizing our community. Collectively, all of our programs and organizations are organized, but it's a very loose group because, as I said, we have so many different tribes and so many different people who are not connected and have not historically been connected to our community. I'm kind of the last person that has that history in terms of, because I came in 1967 and most of our people now older than myself are gone. And I had the great opportunity to work in this community. Even when I worked in other institutions, I always was on boards and I always was volunteering. And I got to meet those leaders from the 60s and the 70s who were the first people to come here, who really were the first to start schools, colleges, the first to start clinics, all of that. They were the first. And so there's a important history there that what you see behind me are still the archives of that time, which we're preparing to probably deposit with the University of Chicago. So they already have some of our things, but this is, to my knowledge, there's no other urban area that has been keeping its archives. So this kind of will tell the story. There's letters, thousands of photographs, there's recordings. It's so important. So this is part of the story that we need to keep discussing and getting out and promoting and teaching our own community as well as others.
Is there a difference? And if so, what is it?
There's no difference. It's just different people that have used different words at different times. Some in Wisconsin, a lot of people use Ojibwe and some people use Ojibwe. We had Ojibwe teachers, so I just adopted that. But really, the name of our tribe in Minnesota is still the Chippewa, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And then, of course, the name for ourselves are the Anishinaabe. So that's how the usage of these words have changed over time. But and we still use the term American Indian because that is the term that is used in the treaties. And so the laws have that term. And as you know, in a law, you can't just go around changing words. Laws have to be maintained. So a lot of people don't understand that. They don't like the word American Indian, and people try to change it. But the bottom line is that is the legal term. There's nothing we can do about history in terms of that term.
Thanks for welcoming us. What would you say to them?
I would say, well, I would welcome them. I think that's part of the values of our culture, is we are always willing to welcome people. Of course, that over the long term, all Native people was our downfall, is that we did believe in sharing. And I just did a interview the other Friday night about the Columbus statue. And I spent the whole day reading about Columbus and all the islands that he visited and the destruction that his people, really were victimized the people that lived there. And they were good people. They were kind people. They were healthy people. And really the Spaniards destroyed them. And so I think but again, I think that that's still a worthwhile value, the value of sharing and caring about other people. I believe that that's the Creator gave us these gifts. It's incredible the land that we were created on. This North America was filled with foods and plants and trees and animals of every kind. Think of it. It was like, and that's why the Europeans wanted it. It was like a Garden of Eden. It was not spoiled. We knew how to live with nature and had done that for thousands of years. And that's how the land was preserved.
Humor and its healing effects have always been a great tool for Native Americans to deal with history and the way it has treated them. At first, Dorene Wiese openly declares that she doesn't really have a great sense of humor. But then, that's exactly what she shows when she's poking fun at some typical Euro-American stereotypes.
What's your sense of humor like?
Oh, I wasn't really born with a sense of humor, but I've kind of developed it more over the years. I'm a very serious person. I'm a very introverted person. So I'm not the kind of person that would like tell jokes or anything, but I have a sister and she's like our family historian. I always say she was the smartest because she has a great memory. You know, people that and are among our people, they were chosen, or the historians were the people that had terrific memories. So I so admire those people because I don't have a great memory for dates and people's names and facts. But my sister is one of those people that has that. So she kind of keeps me, she, as you know, as a sibling, she always just treats me as her sister. So that helps me relate to her in that way. And I try to make her laugh and tell her about stories of things that are happening in Chicago and what I'm doing. Like when I was on television on Friday, the reporter that interviewed me was really impressed that she didn't know that Columbus never came to North America. And so she was so impressed. She goes, I want to get more stories out about Native people. And she goes, I really want to help you. And I said, well, ask your boss if we could get us a show about Native Americans, because they have now a weekly show or monthly show about African Americans and about Hispanics and Asians, but I think they have Asians too, but not us. And she said, so she asked, and then, but her boss said, well, we thought of that, but decided against it. But she said she wasn't going to give up. But my sister said, oh, now you want to be a movie star and you want to have your own show. So she was kind of making fun of me. And but that's important to always have our families members to treat us as family. So it helps keep us humble. And like I said, in return, I try to make her laugh with some things that happen to me on a daily basis. So there are some humorous things, and people call and they ask for really crazy questions. I told her one time we got a call where people wanted to know what kind of bathrooms did Indians have. So this is the kind of, usually it's a call, where do I get my Indian money? They think we're all rich, and we laugh about that at the office. It's like, oh, but then they have to, they get a 15-minute lecture from me about the history of Native people and how, it wasn't all that great to be a Native person. And no, we don't all get bunches of money, free money, and we do pay taxes. So those are the things that I find humor in on a daily basis.
Food is a major focus of the indigenous Renaissance, especially food revitalization, as it is called. It allows urban Indians to connect with the land and whatever it yields. So in Chicago, as well as other big cities in North America, foraging and gardening have become very popular among Native people and others. It includes the cultivation of indigenous crops that have been around for hundreds and thousands of years.
What is the recipe for your favorite American Indian dish?
Mm-hmm. Actually, it's wild rice. It comes from my people and other tribes in the area. And it's funny though, my recipe was improved by one of our students. He was a Zuni cook and he became a student, and he also started our dance company, but he loved to cook. So he kind of perfected a way. He loved only the rice when it was fluffy. He didn't like it when people made it soggy. So he taught us how to make it so it would be fluffy, and he always used chicken broth, and he liked to put chicken, onions on chicken and chicken broth, or just without chicken, fine with him, because the broth does give it more flavoring and salt and pepper. So that's very simple. We didn't have spices. Ojibwe people did not use, at least my parents and my grandparents, they didn't use spices. So to my mom, an onion was spicy. So that's what's so kind of different with cooking today. People add because they have access to spices and other foods, and in especially in the Southwest, where our friend Carlos was from, they like spicier food. They have peppers and other things. But again, even some of the foods were very simple. Their oven bread is very simple, and that's something people have had for thousands of years. We didn't have bread before colonization and before food was given to us with as rations on the reservation. So that was something new, but of course, and that's proven to be very unhealthy for people. So that's one of the things that, but people, I don't think people are ever going to give up bread if they don't have to. They're, people love bread of all different kinds, and so that's kind of amazing. But for me, I really love wild rice. I'd have to say that's my favorite. But fluffy wild rice, like Carlos used to make it.
For example, I'm also aware of the three sisters, so squash, beans, and corn. Where does white rice fit into that picture?
It's the vegetables, and so that the people had, they would grow those and then they would dry them. And so they would use them. Even in all winter, you can then use the dried vegetables with the rice. So I think there's a lot of still to. I love it when people bring forth new recipes in terms of discovering new foraged plants. People have even done workshops on foraging on plants in Chicago. So I love those kinds of things because there are some very, very nutritious plants like milkweeds grow all over in Chicago. They're very nutritious. They're very high in vitamins and iron, and they grow all over now. So then they're also they're good for butterflies and for bees. So I think that's a movement, even among Native people. If they're very small gardens in Chicago for the most part because the lots are small, and so then that there are small areas in your garden that you can plant.
Then it's time to dig a little deeper into Dorene Wiese's own personal background. In the process, we also discuss topics such as urban Indians versus rural Indians or reservation kids. It involves a combination between 20th century history and some of Dorene's childhood memories, which have shaped and sharpened her sense of social justice.
Where did you actually grow up?
I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So that's why I'm so dedicated to urban Indian people, because I did grow up there. Of course, we were closer enough to my mother's reservation to visit often, and she still had family there. But over time, more and more came to live in Minneapolis. And that was also right before, when I left, was right before the American Indian movement was started in Minneapolis. But I was gone by then. So I really wasn't involved in terms of the work that they were doing, but it certainly did have a big impact on Minnesota and for all of us around the country. And then my father's side is a different tribe, is Oneida, and his family was from New York State. And so they found their way to first North Dakota and then to Minnesota. And so that's where my father was born, in Minnesota, but his mother was from the Oneida tribe.
Growing up in an urban area, was that ever an issue for you?
Oh yes, it was. We lived in communities in Minneapolis that were sometimes predominantly white. So that was still before the Civil Rights Act. In fact, we were. When I was in junior high school, my father had purchased a home in a northeast side of Minneapolis, and the block had voted to not let us move in. That they could do that in those days. They could actually have a vote and decide they didn't want people. So, but my father went and he knocked on, told the door to doors. He talked to people, and he was able to smooth things over. My father had a great outgoing personality, and so that it worked out all right. But there was a lot of racism in Minnesota because we didn't have that many other minority people or no immigrants and refugees at the time that we knew of, so that we were the minority. Think of the South where the African Americans were. Well, we were like the African Americans of the South in Minneapolis. So it was mostly white, and we were the minority. So we stuck out, and so people were. There's a lot of research about why people are racist. You know, a lot of it's based on because they don't know the history. Didn't know anything about us, and yet they were prejudiced against us. So that I mean, I'm glad in a way that I experienced that because that made me more sensitive, I think, to all of the social justice issues that are now, taking place around the world. And then I did live I was a volunteer in New York City in the Bronx for 1 year. And so that even opened up my mind more in terms of the meeting people from around the world and from other countries and talking. And it was during the civil rights movement and the women's marches and the education reform. I was really, the 60s were really an incredible time. So I learned a lot during that time, and all of that has helped me, to get to where I am today. And I did want to say one more thing about the urban people. Well, I did mention we're 70% of the population. We receive only 1% of the federal funding. 1%. You've got 70% of the people, 1% of the funding. So I talk about that as that's really another effort at genocide because we can't get funding for our nonprofits. We can't get funding for our schools. We can't get funding for our organizations and for housing and for transportation for our people. We just can't get it. And then we're competing here with thousands of other nonprofits and people that have more political voice. They have money. I always say we have nobody that's like Oprah. We don't have any people, Native people with money. Most of our people are still poor. And I think that's what, that need is what keeps us going. We have to, I believe in education. Education saved me. I came from nothing and I was a poor Indian kid. And all I knew was that people that were educated appeared to live a better life. So I wanted to become educated, and that certainly worked out really well for me. And so it's always a balance too of understanding that the education we received was Western, and that then we had to develop. But I grew up in the 60s, so I knew that we had to develop our own educational systems, and we're still trying to do that. And all of the tribal people are trying to do that, but at least I was aware of it at an early age, so I could pursue that.
What was your favorite children's game?
Oh my goodness. I never liked games because I'm really competitive, but I'm not good at good at games. So that's a joke amongst my friends. No, I don't like any board games. I did as an adult. I learned how to play competitive darts. I had a friend that taught me darts and made me go and be on his team, and I actually got kind of good at that. And then because I could do it a little bit, then I could play it because I wasn't a complete, loser. So but normally I don't like games. No cards, no. I wasn't into sports, volleyball a little bit, but reading is my only has always been my best hobby, and singing. I love singing. I was a folk singer. I wrote my own songs. I was in choirs. Now I've been a singer with drums for like the last 15 years, doing American Indian singing. So that's really my hobby. But reading is my passion, and singing my hobby.
Drum songs. Is that something you remember having grown up with, or is that something you have to learn over again?
I had to learn it from scratch. And I end my research, my dissertation, saying that we have to spend as much time and money with our elders as we did on education. And that's what it cost me to learn. I took care of my mentor, who was a blind man with no legs, who was a singer and a holy man for 13 years while I was doing my dissertation research. So that was my 13 years of learning. And you might say I'm still only about in second grade, but I turned the corner. I know the reality of being a Native person today, and I learning my language. I know music and dance and history, and none of those things were ever taught to me in my home. My parents did not know them, so it was a complete erasure of my uh, of my background, and so I had to start with nothing, only knowing that I had blood connected to these tribes and these people. And so that I think has even fueled my passion more, that I really started with nothing. But again, so I can share that with people and I can tell them we all have to put the time in, the time and the money. You know, our people have a romanticized idea of how the elders should teach them. It's from the movies. They think they're going to sit down by them and they're going to tell them all kinds of beautiful stories. And no, it's not like that. How I end my research is that you can learn a lot from elders, but you're going to have it's an exchange. You have to help them. It's work. You're going to have to work for them. People, when they get old, they need food, they need transportation, they need medical care. You are going to have to provide that. And in that process, you will learn. There's nowhere else to learn it. You're not going to learn it in these thousands of books that we have. It's not the way it's going to happen. And I was fortunate. So again, even though it was a hardship, it laid the foundation for me to really learn so much more.
So again, Dorene Wiese teaches at the University of Illinois at Champaign, where she has native and non-native students and makes sure that they understand the concept and the importance of memory. It is collected in the stories told by the memory holders, the elders. Dorene also wants her students and people in general to understand storytelling as a mutual experience, as part of which the listeners, the younger generation, help elders throughout the potential ordeals they have to face in this day and age.
What advice would you have for a student in your field?
I would say to spend time with elders, to complete your formal education and to study something about your own history, or any history that has some application, because we need that. We need writers, we need people, we need lawyers, we need people who are going to advocate for us, because we don't have that. So that's important. And then also to understand the reality of our people, even there are Native people coming up now that grew up in homes that were more middle class, that did have money, but that's not to forget about the majority who are still poor. And I think that's so important, that we maintain those two roads together, the formal education road, and then also our traditional knowledge roles, that they have to be traveled together. One without the other will not move us forward and help us survive. That's what I've learned, and that's what I tutor my college students that I work with as well. When I teach, I always make them have a service component, that they have to help an elder in some way. And I write that in, and then they have to write about it. And it really is amazing. Even non-Native students have really felt that they now understand more about what the importance of the elders are in their families. And so I think it has a widespread application for all people.
Finally, the time has come to wrap it all up with some poetry. So I asked Dorene Wiese if she is willing to do a reading performance of a poem written by the Ojibwe author Hyde E. Erdrich. Dorene Wiese has never seen the poem before, but her performance is poignant and leads to another discussion about the meaning and significance of such a poem in the general context of Native revival and the indigenous Renaissance. So, the story goes on from there.
Wearing Indian Jewelry by Hyde Erdrich. I was wondering why that guy wore the blanket coat, bone choker, rock watch, woven buckle, quilled Stetson. I was wondering why he wore that beaded vest like a ledger drawing on a winter count. Its skinny figure forever sneaking after two bison, around belly to back, around back to belly. I was wondering why when he said, I wear these get-ups every day because these things are sacred, these things are prayer. Then I knew I could live this life. If I had blue horses painted round and around me, shells and beads like rain in my ear, praying prairie open in me at stoplights, hard city, last call, bank line, coffee break, shopping cart, key code, prairie open in me, every day, every day, every day.
So if this poem was a question for you, what would your answer be?
I think people grapple with kind of how they should look as Native people, because the stereotypes are all that people have all kinds of turquoise jewelry and that they have, Pendleton jackets. And I have all those things too. But, and on TV, sometimes I wear them. And, in special, when we're out with Native people, we might wear them when they're coming to town, or powwows. Like I have regalia, powwow dancing regalia. So it's often that those outer things make us feel like I think we're going to be more accepted. So, but sometimes non-Native people, like the first part I'm reading and I'm almost thinking that that's a non-Native person who is wearing those things. But in fact, that's how sometimes people get mixed up, because they'll see a non-Native person dressed in all those things. So they just say, oh, they must be Native. And when they're not, but even our own people sometimes don't know until they talk to them, so that really that it's in the talking. It's not just in the not in the exterior in terms of how you look or what you have on or what's around you. And so that in the end, when we decide if we believe that someone is really Native, it's in the conversation. It's in the conversation about family and about the hard times that we've had and about, the stories and the art and things like that. But it doesn't stay just with the visual. It always goes beyond that.